The Where Our Minds Wander podcast may contain sensitive content and explicit language. Listener discretion is advised.
Greetings, fellow wanderers, to the places our minds wander.
Where strange lights speed beyond reason across a clear night sky.
The house at the end of the road where disembodied voices whisper and strange noises make the living shiver.
Lurking shadows hiding on the edge of the woods just outside your back door.
Odd, true events throughout time that lead you down the rabbit hole. I'm Wes.
And I'm Beth.
And this is Where Our Minds Wander. Hello and welcome to Where Our Minds Wander, all you fellow wanderers. I'm Wes.
And I'm Beth.
And we're the host of Where Our Minds Wander podcast. Thank you for joining us. If you're new to our podcast, each week, Beth and I delve into topics that piqued our curiosity. Everything from supernatural and paranormal to UFOs, cryptids, fascinating people, and the naturally weird.
If it's odd and interesting, we talk about it.
For tonight's episode, we thought we'd dive in real deep and tell you as much as we could about two sets of sibling mediums.
It's our supersized medium palooza episode. But joking aside, this episode is quite a bit longer than our normal running time, but we thought we have the time and there's a lot of information that is just too interesting to cut, so why not just do it all? So without any further ado, why don't you get us started?
In the hamlet of Hydesville, New York, something strange was happening in the Fox home during the winter of 1848. During the month of March, unexplained rapping, knocking, and thuds woke them up in their one-bedroom cottage. Despite their father explaining it away by saying it was a loose shutter banging against the house, Maggie, age 15, and Katie Fox, age 12, were scared. But not as frightened as their superstitious mother, who immediately thought their house was haunted. On March 31st, after weeks of the unexplained noises, Margaret and John were exhausted and sent their daughters to bed early at 6 o'clock. Not moments later, the house erupted into noises like never before. First, knocks ran across the floorboards, then the ceilings, then at the door frames. The knocking intensified to almost a frantic pace. Margaret lit a candle and searched the house, finding no intruders, of course. It was young Katie who bravely addressed the spirit, calling it Mr. Splitfoot, which is kind of odd, asking it to mimic her when she snapped her fingers. It did it perfectly. Her sister Maggie clapped her hands 4 times, demanding Mr. Splitfoot copy her. He did. Their mother then began asking questions, like who was he exactly, and her girls supplied answers. He was a 31-year-old married peddler with 5 children who had died 2 years earlier. She asked if the spirit would continue to talk, if she invited the neighbors to come over and witness it. The spirit knocked out of agreement. Terrified, Margaret insisted that her husband go to a neighbor for help against the demonic forces she believed were infesting her home. John returned with a neighbor named Mary, and she entered the bedroom that the whole family shared. Maggie and Katie were huddled under the blankets in their parents' bed as the 2 women began to demand that the spirit follow their commands. Miss Fox told the spirit to knock 5 times, and 5 loud thuds filled the air. Then she told it to rap 15 times, and it did. Then she asked Mr. Splitfoot how old the visiting neighbor was, and he knocked 33 times.
I wonder if the neighbor was mad that he got her age right.
Finally, she asked, if you are an injured spirit, manifest it by 3 raps, and the 3 knocks followed. Mary asked Mr. Splitfoot how many children she had and how many were still living. Mr. Splitfoot rapped out correct answers. Mary left the house in a tizzy and promptly told all the other neighbors. The following night, several neighbors gathered in the fox's bedroom with nothing but candles as the eerie knocking, thudding, and cracking continued. One of the neighbors, William Dussler, was brave enough to address the spirit this time, asking questions. David Fox, the girl's older brother, came up with the idea of assigning numbers to letters, and the incredibly intelligent entity spelled out answers through the knocks. The entity told them that he was a 31-year-old peddler who had visited the Fox home when a previous tenant lived there. That tenant had murdered him for the $500 he had on him and buried him under the house. No one knew who the peddler might have been or if it was even true, but in their amazement, no one thought to ask the peddler what his name was. Word spread, and pretty soon, neighbors remembered that there was a peddler who passed through not too long ago. Some even said they recalled David finding human bones and teeth under the house. Neither of these things were true, at least not the human remains under the house part. Pretty soon, the Fox house was filled with curious locals, as well as people from far away, all hoping to hear the ghostly entity trapped within the farmhouse walls communicate with its raps and thuds and cracks. This seemed to divide people rather than bring them together.
I bet.
On one hand, many people now saw the Fox sisters as having divine powers and the ability to speak with the dead, while others denounced them as evil witches. It got so bad that the church asked them to leave. The two young girls had inadvertently started one of the most influential and predominant movements in American history, the Spiritualism Movement. Except, here's the truth, everybody. Maggie and Kate Fox, the Notorious Fox sisters, were just two girls playing a prank on their mother. It was all a hoax. At least that's what they claimed later in life. If this sounds familiar, it could be because you've heard of the Fox sisters before, or because you listened to our Cottingley Ferry episode, where another set of sisters played a prank that went too far.
Right, except the Cottingley fairies were in the middle of the spiritualism movement, and the Fox sisters actually started the movement. They're the whole reason the movement even existed.
That's right. And like I said, they both claimed later in life that it was all a sham. And they explained how they did it. But it's no secret that all three Fox sisters, and we'll get to the third sister in a bit, all succumbed to alcoholism and bitterness and anger towards the end, which made many followers of the spiritualism community question what was really true. Was it all a sham or not? So here's what the younger two Fox sisters claimed in a memoir Maggie wrote in 1888. For whatever reason during the winter of 1848, the two girls decided to play a prank on their mother. They tied apples to strings and thunked them down the stairs to mimic ghostly footsteps. Then they figured out how to essentially snap their toes, like most people snap their fingers, using their big toe and second toe. Or they could crack their toes, like people cracking their finger knuckles. They practiced over and over to the point where they could get it to sound incredibly loud.
I actually know people who can snap their toes, but it's really, really faint. It's almost like a whispering sound more than a snapping.
Well, it's funny that say that, because when I was little, I used to snap my big toe all the time.
What I learned about you, my dear. I'm glad you don't do it anymore.
So the Fox sisters were so good at snapping their toes that they could even do it loud enough inside their shoes to be heard.
That's pretty loud.
To this day, no one can really figure out how they did it so loudly and so well, which is kind of interesting. Back on the night of March 31st, which historians point out was the eve of April Fool's Day, the girls were planning their last hurrah to trick their mother. But when she asked if she could call the neighbors, the two girls didn't know what to do. They knew that they had pushed the joke too far, but they didn't know how to get out of it without getting into big trouble. So they let it go further. And once the neighbors were there, they went with the peddler story. By that time, they felt like there was no turning back. They certainly couldn't admit that it was them all this time, or their family would have been swallowed up by embarrassment. As Maggie put it in her memoir, quote, "We could not confess the wrong without exciting very great anger on the part of those who we had deceived. So we went right on." Not long after, in May of 1848, E. Lewis, who was on his way to becoming a lawyer, arrived in Hydesville to meet Maggie and Kate Fox. He interviewed their parents as well as several neighbors. Then he published a pamphlet called A Report of the Mysterious Noises Heard in the House of John D. Fox in Hydesville, Arcadia, Wayne County.
That's a long title to go on just a little pamphlet.
That it is. I don't think anyone could have predicted what the pamphlet would do or how far it would travel. But it definitely made it to Rochester, where 33-year-old Leah Fox, older sister to Maggie and Kate, got a hold of it. Leah was divorced and a single mother and was incredibly shocked when she read about her own family in Lewis's pamphlet. She made a quick trip home to Hydesville, and whether it was her idea or her parents' idea, she returned to Rochester with her youngest sister. Leah was already interested in the supernatural. She had read a recent book, The Divine Principles of Nature, which was written by a self-proclaimed seer named Andrew Jackson Davis. In his book, Davis relied on much earlier philosophical writings and proposed that the spirit world was reflected in the natural world. He said that we are constantly surrounded by spirits, but most of us just don't realize it. Leah wondered if her younger sisters could be the connection. But she was also a music teacher, not making much money, and maybe she initially worried about the extra financial burden. Regardless, she ended up taking Maggie under her wing too. She supposedly asked the sisters how they had made the rapping sounds and asked them to teach her how to do it too, promising she wouldn't tell anyone else. She was never as good at it as her sisters, but soon Leah's house was filled with all kinds of ghostly noises. Leah played these up as real in her own memoir, claiming that the ghostly activity got so bad once both sisters were in the house that they had to move. Maggie later revealed in her own memoir that Leah was simply grooming them for the road, because not long after, Leah was inviting her friends to come talk to the dead through her sisters. It probably helped that Leah's new house was right next door to a cemetery. The first couple to come over were abolitionist Quakers, who were active members of the Underground Railroad.
Well, at least she had cool friends.
Mr. and Mrs. Post had left their church because they felt that it wasn't open-minded enough. They had recently lost several children, so they were definitely the right type of people to try Leah's first seance. They were adrift from their church, and they were grieving. Although when Leah first told them about the ghost haunting her parents' house and now hers, and that her sisters could communicate directly with the ghosts, the Post asked if they were all delusional. The couple sat down at the seance table with Leah, Maggie, and Kate. Everyone joined hands. Soon, Kate and Maggie appeared to go into a trance-like state. Leah asked all the questions, while Kate and Maggie rapped out answers under the table with their toes, which Leah then translated. The Posts were certain that Leah had communicated with their deceased daughter and became staunch believers in the Fox sisters' powers. Now, Leah was smart. She proclaimed that the ability to talk with the dead had no age restrictions, race restrictions, or religious restrictions. It was a gift that anyone could experience if they had just came to her and her sisters. And so people did. A lot of people.
Well, sure. Most of their audience so far were reformists, so it sounds like Leah tailored it to fit their cause.
But not all of them agreed that there was anything supernatural going on. In late 1849, Leah announced that the spirits told her that they wanted to be revealed to the world, that they needed a bigger stage so that more people could experience communicating with those from beyond. The Post Still, their biggest supporters managed to reserve Rochester's Corinthian Hall, a 400-seat auditorium. The first experience with spiritualism would cost each audience member just 25 cents. At 7 p.m. on Wednesday, November 14th, the first of 4 shows began. It didn't exactly go as planned. You see, most of the audience was not ready for this idea of spiritualism, and they went to the show expecting to be entertained by something they could scoff and laugh at. The crowd even resorted to hissing. They heckled them, basically.
Wow.
The crowd was so sure that it was all a hoax that they even demanded that Maggie and Kate be brought backstage and examined. The Fox sisters agreed, but that it could wait until the next morning. The following morning, a group of Rochester's most prominent citizens arrived at Leah's home and did examine the girls. They left with no answers and proclaimed that they had no explanation for how the girls could be faking it. Over the next several days, other committees tried their best to debunk the Fox sisters. They had them sit on pillows and on glass surfaces. They even sent the girls into another room with female debunkers who searched their clothes for props and gadgets. The last performance of November 17th got incredibly out of hand. First, a bucket of tar was found suspended above the stage, put there by a less than kind disbeliever.
Yikes, they're going to drop tar on them?
People set off fireworks in the back of the auditorium to scare the sisters into revealing their tricks. When that didn't work, a group of men stormed the stage, demanding to see the balls of lead the girls had to be hiding in their clothes to make such rapping and thudding sounds. Attending police officers had to quickly intervene, getting the Fox sisters off stage and out of harm's way. The non-believers complained that the previous committees had to have been paid off in some way, and the Rochester Daily Advertiser complained that, quote, "The wary and eagle-eyed are kept out and excluded from an opportunity of investigation." A reporter from the New York Tribune asked why the spirits would have the mentality of simple children and chose to thump on walls.
That's a good point, because nowadays we assume that it takes an incredible amount of energy for spirits to communicate, right? But back then, when it was relatively new to people, I'm sure they did wonder why all the spirits could do was, like, knock on stuff.
But, as they say, there's no such thing as bad publicity, and the Rochester Corinthian shows catapulted the Fox sisters to national celebrity status. Spiritualism was born, and they accumulated some pretty influential supporters along the way, including P.T. Barnum, of course, as well as the abolitionist Sojourner Truth, journalist William Lloyd Garrison, writer James Fenimore Cooper, and Horace Greeley, the editor of the New York Tribune. Greeley was so taken by them that he offered to pay for Maggie's and Kate's education. He let them stay in his mansion when they went to New York also, hoping that they could make contact with his recently deceased son. It should be noted that Leah did agree for Kate to continue her education, but she refused for Maggie. Maggie later said in life that it was because she was the more talented of the two sisters.
That's just mean.
That
it
is.
That Leah said, oh, Kate can go get her education, but, Maggie can't.
Right.
That's not okay.
Nicknamed the Rochester Rappers, the sisters traveled to New York City in 1850, stopping in Troy and Albany along the way. They had been invited by Andrew Jackson Davis, the man who had written the book that inspired Leah just a few years before. He had heard about their less than welcoming reception at Rochester. In New York City, they found an even bigger circle of influential believers. They were only in the city for 2 days before they had their first big chance. James Fenimore Cooper, among other New York elite writers, was there. It was Cooper's sister that Leah, Maggie, and Kate claimed to be communicating with that night. They described her fatal accident while riding a horse with such detail, despite it happening 50 years earlier, that Cooper was 100% convinced that they were really talking to his sister. George Ripley, Another reporter for the New York Tribune wrote about what he had witnessed, saying that the sisters themselves had no idea how they were able to conjure the dead, and that there was no way that these ladies could be intentionally deceiving anyone. By the end of that summer, they were so popular that songs were being written about them, like Rochester rappers at Barnum's Hotel. Speaking of P.T. Barnum, the sisters booked a suite in his cousin's New York City hotel, the Barnum Hotel. They held massive seances in the hotel parlor, accommodating 30 or 40 people at a time, 3 times a day. They charged $1 to attend, as well as doing private seances for those who were a little more weary of public attention. At these large seances, the spirits would rap along to popular songs and spell out long messages like, quote, "Spiritualism will work miracles in the cause of reform," which is pretty interesting since most of their followers were avid reformists.
Right. Play to the crowd, right? And I can bet they were making boatloads of money.
Well, I would assume so. And since the younger girls were a little bit older now, they split off from Leah in order to travel all over the country, hitting every major city. It was during one of these tours that Maggie met Elish Kent Kane, a man who was 13 years older than her. Kane was convinced that Maggie and Kate were frauds, but he couldn't prove it. Eventually, he fell in love with Maggie and convinced her to retire and go to school. She did, probably making Leah pretty mad. But Maggie had tried to quit once before, refusing to do any seances for 12 days. She was shocked by how quickly it affected their finances, though, and she finally gave in and went back to mediumship. This time was different. She married Kent, but they weren't married for very long before he died. Maggie converted to Catholicism in order to honor him, and she vowed to never return to spiritualism. Unfortunately, in her grief over his death, she turned to alcohol and ended up with a heavy drinking problem. Kate had also married, but her husband was a devout spiritualist. Her career as a medium flourished to the point that she could deliver 2 different messages from the dead at the same time. She'd write one message down while verbally delivering a second completely different message. She was able to produce entire messages written completely in reverse letters and then translate them immediately.
That's so cool. So essentially she was doing automatic writing, but she was writing it completely backwards. So for say the word name, she'd write out E-M-A-N?
Yes, but she'd do entire sentences.
If she was faking it, that takes talent. But if it was authentic, why would ghosts give her messages that were backwards?
Well, that I have no clue. She could also make words appear on blank white cards. Her abilities had grown so strong that she was also conjuring apparitions during her seances. She did really well immediately after the Civil War, when grieving families were desperate to contact their deceased loved ones. But then things started to crumble. One spiritualist named Emma Hardings wrote that the war added 2 million new believers to the movement. By the 1880s, there were an estimated 8 million spiritualists in the United States and Europe.
Wow.
Kate felt the pressure to perform, and she too began to drink. Her drinking got so bad that after the untimely death of her husband in 1885, she was arrested in New York City for public drunkenness, and she lost custody of her sons. Maggie tried to get the welfare system to give the boys to her, but they ended up with a relative in England instead. Also in 1885, Maggie was put to the test in New York City when a committee summoned her to come and prove that she was legit. She failed her test. Perhaps it was because her drinking and new devout faith made her question if her powers were in fact evil. By 1888, all 3 Fox sisters were drinking pretty heavily, and they really weren't getting along at this point. It didn't help that the spiritualists who had supported them now didn't want anything to do with them because of their drinking problems. It all came to a head in October of 1888 when a reporter offered Maggie $1,500 to reveal to the world how she and her sister had tricked people for the last 40 years. Maggie appeared at the New York Academy of Music on October 21st in front of an audience of 2,000 people. Her sister Kate was there to show her support in front of all those people, including several reporters. Maggie removed her shoe and placed her right foot upon a wooden stool. She produced several short, very loud raps. A doctor on stage confirmed that the incredibly loud raps that they all heard were indeed produced by her foot. The New York Herald reported, quote, "There stood a black-robed, sharp-faced widow, working her big toe and solemnly declaring that it was in this way she created the excitement that has driven so many persons to suicide or insanity. One moment, it was ludicrous. The next, it was weird." Maggie went on later to say that her sister, Leah, knew all along that her and Kate were producing the sounds, and that she decided to exploit her siblings out of greed. Then she thanked God and that she was able to expose spiritualism and walked off the stage. The New York World published an article in tandem with her shocking revelation, going into more detail, exposing how they first used apples on strings and then progressed to the toe cracking. She was quoted as saying, "A great many people, when they hear the rapping, imagine at once that the spirits are touching them. It is a very common delusion. Some very wealthy people came to see me years ago when I lived in 42nd Street, and I did some rappings for them. I made the spirit rap on the chair, and one of the ladies cried out, 'I feel the spirit tapping me on the shoulder.' Of course, that was pure imagination." Staunch spiritualists rose in outrage, saying that yes, perhaps the early days of their mediumship were based in trickery. But over the years, the sisters had undoubtedly developed authentic abilities. They denounced Maggie as a drunk and said she was only saying these things out of spite against Leah. Others say that she had failed as a medium for several years at that point, and she had changed sides in order to make money speaking out against them. Others claim that Maggie's confession was the real sham, that the sisters were disgusted by Leah's years of making a fortune off them and tired of it, and they wanted to end their sister's financial hold over them. Regardless, Maggie's confession was a massive blow to the movement, despite her recanting it a year later. She later said that her spirit guides had been begging her for an entire year to take back what she had said, but by then it was too late. The movement itself had taken a huge hit, and the Fox sisters' reputations were ruined. The younger sisters never reconciled with Leah, who died in 1890. Kate died in 1892 after a drinking binge. She was found by one of her sons. Maggie died at the age of 59 in March of 1893. She was penniless and passed away in the home of a friend in Brooklyn. And there you have it, folks. For what it's worth, I definitely believe that certain people are truly gifted.
I do too. I mean, I also believe that there are some people out there who are charlatans, for lack of a better word. But I also believe that there are people out there who do have genuine abilities.
Right. But with that said, because I have an open mind and a curiosity for the unexplained, I do my due diligence to rationalize, debunk, and exhaust all possible avenues for signs of trickery and earthly explanations. Also, with that said, it really doesn't matter to me that the Fox sisters were a hoax. They were fascinating, creative young women who, for good or bad, got people to take a moment and come together to think about the paranormal.
Exactly. And even if we're no closer to really understanding it, there are theories now, like the multiple dimensions theory, where all timelines are happening at the same time, and that's what people think ghosts are. Or there's the tulpa theory, where ghosts are actually created by our own minds. The Fox sisters started that whole movement of study, and without them, none of those theories would even exist. So it's pretty amazing.
You're very right.
Hey, did you know? 65-year-old former President George Washington was a moonshiner. Well, at least he knew one, and let him run a still at Mount Vernon. It was so successful that Washington ended up owning the largest distillery in America. Using his abundant rye crop, Washington's outfit produced 11,000 gallons of clear, unaged whiskey in 1799 on just 5 stills. His mash recipe consisted of 65% rye grain, 35% corn, and 5% malted barley. His 11,000 gallons netted him $120,000 in today's money. Who'da thunk it?
So which sibling mediums are you going to tell us about tonight, Beth?
Okay, so when I came across these two brothers, it caught my eye because it basically happened in our backyard, and I had never heard of them before. I'd heard of a lot of the people who were involved, like on the sidelines, but not this family specifically. So, let me take you back to a schoolhouse in Chittenden, Vermont in the mid-1800s. There were rumors swirling around the Eddy Brothers, Horatio and William, for years. It began with their grandmother, 4 times removed, Mary Bradbury, who was accused of witchcraft in Salem in 1692. She managed to escape before her sentence was carried out. Everyone knew that the Eddy Brothers' grandmother went into trances and talked to beings that no one else could see. Their mother, Julia, often freaked out the neighbors with her visions and predictions. By all accounts, the two boys were perfect fodder for bullying. It didn't help that stories spread through town that both boys mysteriously disappeared from their cradles when they were babies and would reappear in various other rooms of the family farmhouse, or they'd even be found outside. So you can imagine, the schoolroom might not have been the kindest place for Horatio and William, but on this day, both boys are bent over their books, trying their best to read. Maybe the teacher is standing at the front of the room, listening as other children recite their lessons. Suddenly, the full ink bottle sitting on the teacher's lectern starts to vibrate, just the tiniest bit. No one even notices. But then, it begins to move more violently until it flies off the lectern and crashes to the floor, sending ink and glass everywhere. As all the students turn to stare and the teacher's head swivels towards the sound, neither Horatio nor William look up from their books. They weren't ignoring what was going on, or they weren't hard of hearing, and they weren't bad students, but one or both of them may be in the middle of one of their frequent trance-like states, and they couldn't look up. No one was watching them. They were still transfixed by the broken inkwell, still oozing black ink on the floor. Suddenly, a book flies across the room as if thrown, smacking into the wall before thumping to the floor. All heads turn to look at William and Horatio now, the direction the book came from. What they see is unexplainable. 2 or 3 books are hovering in midair, and Horatio's desk is suspended several inches above his knees. You see, the Eddy brothers had supernatural powers. Now, the little scene I just set is entirely my own version of what may have happened in that Chittenden schoolroom. What all the sources do say is that the Eddy brothers were known to levitate school books, desks, and ink bottles while at school, and they were forbidden from ever setting foot in the school building again.
Well, I imagine it probably scared the hell out of their classmates and teachers.
Since their schooling ended at such a young age, the brothers spent all of their time at home on the family farm. The entire family, their mom Julia, father Zephaniah, and sister Mary, all began to experience strange pounding on the farmhouse's walls that none of them could explain. objects frequently levitated at home too, but it wasn't just Horatio and William who were to blame for that. Their sister Mary was also prone to falling into trances, and then things would just move.
That's incredible.
Things really came to a head when Zephaniah witnessed his children talking to strange children out in the fields, only to watch in shock as these strange children just vanished into thin air. Zephaniah did not like the idea that his wife claimed to be clairvoyant, and most definitely did not like the idea that his children were seemingly capable of moving things with their minds, or summoning what he could only assume were deceased children. So, each time he caught one of his sons going into one of these trances, he'd march them out to the barn and whip them. The whippings didn't stop the trances or the visitations by child spirits. So, Zephaniah tried other things to snap them out of their trances. He'd pinch or slap them. This didn't work either, and Zephaniah, who was a religious man, decided to heed the advice of a Christian friend and doused his sons with boiling water. When that didn't work, he had his friend drop a red-hot coal into William's open palm, attempting to, quote, exorcise the devil that he felt had taken over his children's souls. Even his burning flesh didn't wake William from his trance.
That's disturbing.
So, I need to kind of interrupt myself for a minute here because I know I'm looking at it from a 21st century perspective, which maybe I should hold back from doing, but I can't help it. What if these trances were really the children's way of mentally removing themselves from a stressful situation? Like they literally went somewhere else in their minds to escape whatever was really happening in front of them. And what if all the activity in their home was poltergeist activity brought on by their combined stress that they were under? And their father treating them this way just made it worse.
Well, it certainly wouldn't help.
So all the accounts I read describe Zephaniah as cruel and unfeeling. And I have to agree because he was downright abusing his children. But then again, in the 1850s and 60s, maybe he was only doing what he thought was the right thing because he thought his children were possessed by the devil. So I don't know, and it's a slippery slope, but when I was reading about all the things that he was doing to his children, it really upset me, and it turned my stomach.
Well, you certainly wouldn't be able to get away with that kind of abuse these days.
No. There was one account I found that said the spirits the boys were communicating with actually tried to protect them from their father by scaring Zephaniah out of the house. But he dealt with that by selling them to a traveling show. This traveling showman took the boys all over the United States and Canada and Europe to show off his young mediums who would go into trance-like states so that spirits could come through and speak from the other side. But he decided that a good moneymaker would be to challenge paying customers to try and shake the boys from their trances just like their father had done. So the abuse that they suffered got even worse, like really, really bad.
Poor kids.
When person after person couldn't awaken them, the spectators got scared, and they often formed mobs that would chase them out of town, throwing rocks at them, and according to one account I read, they would even shoot at them. And the boys had bullet scars on their bodies and permanent marks from being pinched and punched and stoned by these showgoers, and from the handcuffs that the showman put on them. But the worst thing that I found were the times that they were locked into wooden boxes and then hot wax was poured into their mouths to see if the disembodied voices would still happen.
My God, that's sick.
It's awful. But the boys survived for 14 years as captives of this showman until the death of their father. In 1870, they returned home to Chittenden and the family farm. They turned the farmhouse into the Green Tavern, welcoming weary travelers for $8 a week. They offered seances in the house, which had fallen on hard times. The parlor was described as dingy, but spiritualism was so popular that people just didn't care. And very quickly, Chittenden became known as the spirit capital of the universe.
I had no idea. And we can see Vermont from our house.
I know. I had no idea that the spirit capital of the universe was right across the lake. Word spread so quickly that the Eddy Brothers, reunited with their equally gifted sister Mary, were offering seances, and people came from all over, including Madame Helena Blavatsky. So Helena Blavatsky was basically the woman when it came to spiritualism. She founded the Theosophical Society in 1875, and she traveled all over the world. When it came to the spiritualist movement, at least at this point in the movement, she was the face of the whole thing in a lot of ways. And when she came to Chittenden, she was very impressed by the Eddy Brothers, and she deemed them genuine, which was a big deal. But not everyone was convinced. Being known as the spirit capital of the universe certainly brought skeptics to the area, too. One such skeptic, journalist Henry S. Olcott, came to see things for himself, staying at the Eddy's Green Tavern for 10 weeks in 1874. His intent was to debunk them once and for all. Olcott was no novice reporter. He had written for the New York Tribune in the 1850s before joining the Civil War. After the war, he continued writing and he practiced law. He had come across an article about the Eddy Brothers of Vermont, and he and New York Daily Graphic newspaper artist Alfred Kappas made the trip to Chittenden. Olcott expected to denounce them in his article, but he did have an open mind. If he couldn't debunk them, he would announce to the world that spiritualism and mediumship was a real thing. Now, this kind of made me laugh a little, but Olcott didn't like the Eddy Brothers at all. He complained that their accents made them almost impossible to understand, and their gruff manner didn't help. He referred to them often as illiterate and on bad terms with all of their neighbors.
Well, didn't he realize what these kids had been through?
No, I don't think so. In his first article, and he wrote 15 total about them, he said, quote, "There is nothing about the Eddys or their surroundings to inspire confidence on first acquaintance. The brothers Horatio and William, who are the present mediums, are sensitive, distant, and curt to strangers, look more like hard-working rough farmers than prophets or priests of a new dispensation, have dark complexions, black hair and eyes, stiff joints, a clumsy carriage, shrink from advances, and make newcomers feel ill at ease and unwelcome." Even his description of the Green Tavern is unflattering. He referred to it as unkept and plain. So, not the best review for an inn if you're trying to get people to come and stay there.
No, but I think they were doing pretty well for everything that they had been through in their life up to this point.
Absolutely. It's amazing to me that they were functioning
At all.
Despite how he felt, Olcott stuck around, perhaps more determined than ever to prove that they were charlatans. But that didn't happen. By the end of his 10-week stay, Olcott swore he witnessed over 400 different apparitions and witnessed things he couldn't possibly explain, despite his best efforts. During the evening of the first day, Olcott, along with Kappas and 8 other participants, walked down a path with no light besides the moon. It was a bright, warm summer evening. They stopped in a ravine and gathered in front of a natural cave, created by 2 large stones that had fallen on top of each other in a sort of arch. Olcott did his due diligence, examining this cave from all angles, determining that there was only one way in and one way out. the same way. One entrance and exit. Horatio sat down on a camp stool under the arch, and William set up shawls attached to branches to make a sort of enclosure around him. These shawls would act as a spirit cabinet, from inside which Horatio would speak to the dead, asking spirits to come forward. All eyes were on Horatio when suddenly a massive man stepped out from the darkness of the cave. There had been no one there just moments before. Olcott had made sure of it. This huge man was dressed as a Native American, and as Horatio asked him questions, one of the witnesses cried out, pointing to the top of the cave. Standing there with the moon shining behind him was another equally giant man. He too was dressed in Native American clothes. Before anyone could even process what they were seeing, a third spirit materialized. This time, a woman, standing precariously on a ledge near the cave. Within minutes, a total of 9 Native American spirits had emerged from the dark to speak through Horatio Eddy.
That's pretty incredible.
And that wasn't all. A 10th spirit materialized. But he didn't just appear out of the air. This one walked right out of the tiny spirit cabinet enclosure that Horatio was in. He was much taller than William, so it couldn't be him. And he claimed to be William White, an editor of a spiritualism newspaper. And everyone knew William White was no longer living. Now, during all this, which I find really fascinating, Olcott didn't stay in his seat. He approached the apparitions to determine that they weren't just neighbors in on a hoax. He even managed to measure how tall they were so he could compare it to living people, I assume. After the apparitions vanished and Horatio announced the seance over for the night, Olcott and Kappas both inspected the ground all around the cave and the spirit cabinet and found no footprints. But he wasn't deterred. Although this first display was intriguing, Olcott was not entirely convinced, and he figured any seances held inside the house would be much easier to debunk. The house was pretty plain, just a simple 2-story white farmhouse that had additions put on it over the years that turned it into an L shape. The second floor of the addition was entirely used for spirit communication. It was essentially an empty room with very little furniture and could only be accessed by one door that led down to the center of the original house. In it, there was only a stove, a handful of chairs, and 2 rough-cut benches for sitting on. There was a 4x2 table with various musical instruments on it, an accordion, some bells, and a violin. But at the end of the room, farthest from the door, was a wooden platform, about 4 feet wide by 2 feet high, with a low railing around it. There were also a few small steps leading up to it. The platform held nothing but a permanent spirit cabinet, about 8 feet long by 2 feet wide, made from lathe and plaster. It had only one entrance, which was simply a hanging blanket, and one whole wall of the cabinet was made by the house's central chimney. And what Olcott witnessed in that room blew his mind. Over the course of the next 9 days, he was bombarded by spectacles he'd never seen before. Around 7:30 p.m. each night, as many as 18 spectators would enter the seance room and sit on the hard benches or in the few chairs. They would be asked to join hands to create a sort of energy battery. Then, William would go inside the empty spirit cabinet. Horatio would sit on the platform in a wooden chair and begin to play the violin, even encouraging the audience to sing along. Then he'd stop playing, and in the ensuing silence, soft whispers would fill the air. Music, played by instruments not on the table, could be heard. Unseen hands would touch the spectators' shoulders as if ghosts floated around the room. Musical instruments would hover over their heads, playing themselves. Strange lights would dart from corner to corner. Then, the spirit cabinet's blanket would be shoved aside as the first apparition stepped through onto the platform. But it wasn't William. It couldn't be, because soon as many as 15 or 20 spirits would be crowding the platform, entering one by one from the cabinet. The apparitions ranged from very tall, upwards of 6 feet, to very short. Some appeared as solid as living, breathing humans, while others shimmered and wavered, almost translucent. Most seemed to be elderly Yankees or Native Americans, but not always. Sometimes an audience member would instantly recognize one of them as a dead loved one and converse with them in a completely foreign language.
That's so cool.
Olcott reported that he heard the spirits speak in Russian and in Chinese and in some other languages that he wasn't even sure what they were. At other times, 2 members of the audience would be invited to join Horatio behind a short curtain, where all 3 of their heads would be visible to the audience. Horatio would grasp one of the audience members' arms, and the second audience member would grasp Horatio's other arm. William would be seated in the wooden chair on the other side, fully visible to the audience. Then, musical instruments would just float up into the air over their heads. A disembodied hand would snake out from behind the curtain and scrawl messages on a slate that William was holding up for everyone to see. Each night, Olcott was just blown away by what he had seen. But during the daylight hours, he was more determined than ever to debunk the brothers. He assumed that the Eddy Brothers must have help, that a band of fellow charlatans, actors perhaps, were using some sort of secret passageways to get into the spirit cabinet. He made painstakingly detailed sketches of the platform, measuring each board and angle with precision, convinced that he'd find evidence of a concealed passageway or false walls. He found none. Wondering if his math skills were lacking, he hired expert engineers and carpenters to come in and validate his findings. And they did. There was no evidence whatsoever of false walls or trapdoors or any other means in which other people could hide in the wings and then dupe the audience like Olcott suspected. Now, remember, Horatio and William had been part of a traveling show for 14 years. So Olcott was sure that they must have picked up some tricks along the way. He assumed, based on their lack of schooling and traveling with the show all those years, that they were still illiterate, and he doubted that they were able to speak all of the foreign languages he had heard during the seances. So he returned to the idea that they couldn't be doing this all on their own. And don't forget their sister Mary, who I felt in my research tended to be kind of sidelined. She wasn't mentioned very much. But they kept saying she had greater powers than her brothers, which I thought was weird. If she had such great powers, why wasn't there more written about her? But I don't know. Olcott surmised that putting on a show like the ones he witnessed 6 nights a week would have been incredibly expensive. Hiring actors, sewing costumes, replacing props. But by all accounts, the Eddy Brothers did not have much money. They only charged $8 a week to overnight guests. But no one who came to the nightly seances were charged anything. They were completely free. Which, to me, really says a lot. I mean, it would be one thing if they were charging people, but since they weren't, it makes it more believable to me.
Yeah, I've never heard of them before, so at this point, it sounds pretty incredible. It's something I definitely want to see firsthand. I mean, for not charging anything, this is a lot to go through to prove that they have abilities.
Yeah, and I think that was Olcott's final kind of decision or verdict. You know, they went through an awful lot with not a lot of money, and they weren't charging anybody. So it's said that he left the Green Tavern disliking the house, the food, the weather, and the Eddy Brothers themselves.
Wow.
But He was thoroughly convinced that they were the real deal, and he wrote a book about them called People from the Other World. Olcott wasn't the only reporter or journalist or even curious skeptic who visited the Green Tavern looking to debunk the Eddy Brothers. There were plenty of others. But most, if not all, came away with an experience they could not explain. But then, in 1875, it all came to a crashing end. Olcott had also publicly endorsed a medium in Philadelphia who summoned a spirit named Katie King. It turned out that Katie King was really a 40-year-old down-on-her-luck woman trying to pay her rent by pretending to be a dead woman. Olcott's reputation was basically ruined, and word spread quickly. If he was wrong about Katie King, then he was most likely wrong about the Eddy Brothers.
Well, not necessarily.
No, I mean, you and I would look at it that way, but public sentiment back then was, if he was wrong about one, he had to be wrong about all.
Yeah, I agree.
The Vermont newspaper, the St. Albans Weekly Advisor, ran an article that I would love to read the whole thing, but I'm just going to shorten it down because it was really long. It says, quote, Colonel Olcott is in Philadelphia convincing himself that Katie King was not a sham. He is attending seances held by Mr. and Mrs. Holmes, at which John King and Katie regularly appear. Olcott says that all of the tests which he applies as a scientist, ? Prove the reality of the manifestations. The woman who confessed to personating Katie King last fall proved to be a Mrs. White, about 40 years old, and the wife of a saloon keeper in Winstead, Connecticut. She has not lived with her husband of late and has assumed several different names. She says that she took a house in Philadelphia last March and that Mr. and Mrs. Holmes boarded with her. Soon afterward, they hired her to help in the spiritual exhibitions. The theory now held by Olcott is that when the materialized Katie failed to appear, Mrs. White was introduced and that the present manifestations are honest. So the St. Albans paper pretty much ripped Olcott apart. And I mean, St. Albans and Chittenden are relatively close in the scheme of things. So word was going around Vermont that Olcott was not to be considered genuine anymore.
Right.
And unfortunately, that wasn't it. The New York Sun published an article saying that the chimney in the Eddy farmhouse had a second flue that people could feasibly have used to go from the kitchen directly into the seance room. The article goes on to say that hired actors, or in some cases Mary Eddy, would change into costumes in William's room, which was directly off the kitchen. William would come down to the kitchen through the flue to give them their cue, and then one by one, the actors would climb back up the flue directly into the spirit cabinet. But I have questions, though. Like, why didn't Olcott catch that then? I mean, the papers basically call him gullible and attack his skills as a scientist, but if he really did hire carpenters and engineers, then how did they miss it too? And then how did all of those spirits, especially when there were 20 or 30 of them in one night, all get back down the chimney without anybody in the audience noticing?
Well, how are these two paying them?
Yeah, they were only charging people that stayed for a whole week. So most of the audience members that were coming for the seances were not staying there.
Right. And they weren't paying anything to come to the seances. That makes no sense to me.
These articles went on to say that their costumes were poorly made, and if anyone with an ounce of skepticism really looked, they'd see that it was the same handful of actors reappearing several times. But still, again, I don't think everybody was that gullible. Not everybody. Magician Chung Ling Soo thought so. Chung Lee Soo was really William Ellsworth Robinson, a pretty well-known magician. He came forward to say he knew exactly how the Eddy Brothers were doing that one trick, as he called it, the one where the audience members sat behind the curtain with Horatio grasping each other's arms. Sue said it was nothing more than a heavy fake arm and hand inside Horatio's jacket that made it all work. the audience member believed that they were grasping Horatio's actual arm, when in fact his real arm was free to move about and write things on William's slate. Psychical researcher Harewood Carrington, the same one who influenced Nandor Fodor from episode 41, I think. Well, he agreed with Sue, and he called the Eddy's tricks, quote, absurdly simple. As you can imagine, all of this negative publicity pretty much ruined them. They tried doing their own traveling show through upstate New York for a bit, and I tried to find exactly where, but I couldn't find anything that said where in upstate New York. But it would be so cool if they came here.
Well, I think most certainly they probably stopped here because basically from Vermont to New York State, if they went across through Ross's Point, or even they took a ferry from Vermont to New York State, one of the first places they would stop in is either Ross's Point or in Plattsburgh.
Right.
Very interesting.
Unfortunately, like the Fox sisters, bickering and infighting eventually broke the Eddy brothers apart. Mary ended up moving to East Pittsford, and she became a full-time medium. But Horatio moved into a house across the road from the Green Tavern, which I found very interesting. Like, he didn't move away, he just moved across the road, which seems like such a brother thing to do. I'm mad at you.
But I'm going to stare at you every day.
Yes.
Angrily out my window.
Yes. And it's said that William became a complete recluse. He never married, and he refused to have anything to do with spiritualism for the rest of his life. He died in 1932 at the age of 99. Today, the former Green Tavern is still in Chittenden, which isn't far from Rutland, Vermont, and it's a ski lodge now.
So this still doesn't prove that they were fakes to me.
No, I know.
Not at all.
I know. The jury's out with me, too.
Yeah. They could have very well been legit. I mean, it makes no sense why they wouldn't be charging for these seances. They weren't wealthy people.
Right. And you would think after all the abuse that they went through, right, all the years of being abused by their father and then by this traveling showman, that even if they did pick up some tricks and some showman kind of things and they were using it, you would think they would use it to make money.
Right. They weren't entirely stupid people.
No, not at all.
They put this on together every night.
6 nights a week. Yeah.
That's pretty incredible and exhausting.
Exhausting.
Yeah, for me, the jury's out on this one.
How cool that they're so nearby, though.
It is very cool.
And I guess that ends our medium palooza for the night.
I just find it so funny that I've never knew about them. You know, I think I've heard about everybody associated with the paranormal throughout the years, but I never knew they were so close to us.
No, and what's odd is I heard about them maybe 6 months ago, maybe a year ago. I don't think it was that long ago. And I came across them by accident for something else that I was looking up. And I found some stuff, but not a lot. But then in the last week or so, when I looked them up again, it was like the internet had exploded with information about them. So I don't know what changed, if it was an anniversary of some kind and people started writing about them or what, but there was a lot more now than there was before.
Yeah, I have no clue. Well, I learned something new again tonight. So I guess with that said, that about wraps it up for this episode.
I think so, and thank you all for listening.
Yeah, join us next week for an all-new episode of Where Our Minds Wander. And if you could take a moment, please tell your friends about us. And if you would leave a like and a comment on your favorite listening platform for us, it would be greatly appreciated. So we'll see you all next week.
See you soon. Thank you for joining us. We look forward to traveling with you again to the places where our minds wander.
If you like what you heard, please take a moment and provide us with a 5-star rating and a comment on your favorite listening platform. It really helps us move up the list and become more visible on the podcast charts so new people can find us.
Thank you all for your continued support.
See you all next week. for an all-new episode of Where Our Minds Wander.